At some point, Claire wrapped herself inside her cloak. Holding the edges tight against her arms, she let the turbulent winds shape the cloth into its elongated form and gave up trying to see anything. Ducking underneath her hood, feeling the currents twist her about, twirl her, shove her from side to side, hardly knowing which way was up or down, she handed control off to her means of flight, to Samson. Otherwise, she would still be trying to peer through the blurred wisps, knowing the direction she was facing was about to change multiple times, and she wasn't even aware whether or not her head was being jerked about, on the verge of snapping her neck. Not only that, but she kept colliding into Imala. Maybe it was her foot, then her back, or her hand might come across her face. She couldn't see these instances coming, never could spot Imala among the currents, and then something solid would come her way. The whole time, Imala was giggling, and that made Claire all the more glad she had wrapped herself within her cloak. There before that first hot spring, in that temple chamber, and then just before exiting that cove, her cloak had staved off contact with both Samson and Asham in their beyond forms. Imala was always subject to the effects. There was no escape for her inside Samson's form. Her squeals never ceased in reaching new pitches. Of course, why wouldn't she be enjoying herself, wrapped within the vigor of her lover, while soaring through the skies like no one else could? Claire had never been this high off the ground before, never traveled like this either, and yet she had to close herself off from the experience. Tangled up with two lovers like this, perhaps Samson's new form had redefined certain limits for him, and Imala's inhibitions would surely match his, but she knew she didn't belong. Despite this being their only means of escaping that ravine, the turbulence made her think of certain matters, and yes, she just wanted this to end. She had lost all sense of time, and she wondered if that was an element of the new life Samson had begun. But she wasn't like him. Neither was Imala. Not yet, anyway. Would this have some side effects she'd have to worry about later on? Imala was already over the edge, cursed by her participation in the rings, and doomed to pursue the same path as Samson. "Here we are," he cheered, and Claire felt the wisps coaxing her body in what she could only assume was an upright posture. And boom! Claire's feet met a solid surface, and the air shook against her before falling downward and then rushing away. Her mind was still tumbling about the sky, so she had no idea she was falling backward. Not until she lifted her head to peer from the small opening in her hood. By that time, it was too late. She was seeing rocks, sky, clouds, and the light of the sun before she felt a solid surface crash against her back. Seeing stars now, she coughed and threw her arms outward, taking the edges of her cloak with them. Sprawled along whatever surface they lay upon, she was waiting for her head to stop spinning before she tried to lift herself. Noticing a soft breeze brushing across her face and down the front of her body, somehow she knew that wasn't Samson. Where was he? Imala was still giggling somewhere close by. "You okay?" That was Samson. There was laughter in his tone. "Ee-hee-hee, I'm fine," Imala responded. Samson laughed at her. Before Claire raised herself up, she imagined a time in the past when she, Imala, and Samson had teamed up to go off on some mission for the agency. They could all count on each other. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. They would even plan how they would celebrate their accomplished mission afterward. Now, though, how would it be now? Imala was still giggling when Claire sat up. She almost didn't recognize the fort she infiltrated at the beginning of all of this. Seeing it in the sunlight, she would have to let its form settle in her eyes, but she disregarded it. Looking straight ahead, she found Imala stretched out along the ground like before, only now she was bending her lower body and upper body in separate directions, and stretching her arms above her head while wearing a big, pleased smile. She was gazing up through heavy-lidded eyes at the stirring collection of wind that was looming over her. At first, Claire imagined this scene to be an acolyte, fortunate enough to be visited by the deity she worshipped, totally enthralled by their presence. The winds not only took on a humanoid form, but they reached upward like waving tendrils, having descended from some higher plane. The stone around his feet was being brushed by a cycle of breaths, seen as feather-like rings expanding outward and then dissolving. They even brushed across Imala's body. Just standing there, he was still touching her with little effort. It was no wonder she was still giggling and squirming around. But Claire had to know. "Samson," she said. The head whipped around, pointing those shadowed eye pits her way. Yeah, she thought. Even without all the details, she could make out the slight movements of muscles, showing that the eyes were expressing an alertness to her simply addressing him. It had been an expression she had gotten from him many times when she had to call his name to get his attention. The rest of his body turned slightly in her direction. The cycle of breaths along the surface around his feet followed this small change. The crescent shape below the eyes moved when he responded. "How about you, Claire? You okay?" That voice, and just saying her name, hit her in a way she couldn't explain. She was hearing someone she knew, but seeing something else. "Yeah, how about it, Claire?" Imala giggled, rolling over to lay upon her side. Her head still resting against the stone, she continued, "Was it good for you?" Before Claire could respond, Samson spoke up. "Nah, it wasn't the same for her. You know Claire, she hardly ever parts with that cloak of hers." Imala picked her head up and grimaced at Claire. "Boo, you're no fun." Claire regarded her a moment, but then her gaze settled once more upon Samson. The way he stood there, not like a proud deity, but simply as himself, only covered by the wind. He had turned back to Imala because of her remark. She was picking herself up from the stone surface, her heavy-lidded eyes fixed upon him. Then she pranced over, throwing her arms out before crashing into him, wrapping her arms around the wavy surface of his body. He threw his head back and laughed, enveloping her inside his arms. She wiggled and squealed against him. Imala was again making contact with Samson in his beyond form. The simple act of coming in contact with someone like this, was it always so euphoric? While Imala squirmed against him, Samson looked over at Claire. "Can you stand? You're not hurt, are you?" It wasn't like that, Claire thought. It wasn't even the idea of being so high up in the air just moments before. Really, her orientation had been so off the entire trip, and because she couldn't see, she couldn't have gotten her bearings to even experience the shock of high elevation. "I'm fine," she offered as Imala twisted around to face her. Samson dropped his arms and placed one hand upon Imala's shoulder. "I should have said something before," he said. "Sorry about that." Imala was presenting the back half of her body into his, and to Claire, it almost looked as if she could have been absorbed inside him. Reaching up to cup the back of his neck in her hands, she hung from there, leaning her upper half a bit forward while she arched her lower back. Standing on the tips of her toes, she was pressing the lower section of her rear into what Claire could only assume was Samson's pelvic region. Having positioned herself that way, Imala's lips parted in a silent gasp. That was it, Claire thought. Here in the bright sunlight, Imala wasn't even trying to hide her nudity, nor was she trying to suppress her urges. With her breasts totally exposed, her nipples were erect, and even with her lower half arched in such a way, her pubic hair was short and fine, hiding nothing. Her skin was a bit tanner than Claire's, but there was no hiding the way her groin was blushing. With the way Samson's body was always in motion, the entire of her private area was being stimulated. Because it was much like an arcane drug, she wasn't going to deny herself of it. Samson suddenly noticed her slight gyrations and dropped his gaze to study her, placing his other hand upon the side of her right buttock. Claire could only watch the display for so long, and then she turned her head, thankful that her hood gave her extra cover. She still had the look on Samson's face in her mind. With only so many details given, she could still recognize the look of desire there. "So why are we here?" she asked over Imala's constant gasps and giggles. Samson looked up to see Claire was looking away. He turned his head in the direction she happened to be facing. The fort stood tall and silent several yards away. Samson had placed them in the yard before the stone platform in front of the structure's entrance. Seeing this, she looked away from the fort, finding the body of the first mage she had struck with her ghostly blade. "You did this, huh?" Samson asked. Looking past that mage toward the old entrance to the yard, Claire saw the remains of the 2 lookout stations on the other side of the fort wall. "Not sure if it matters, really," Claire said, turning back to gaze at the fort again. "But perhaps the agency will come and clean this place up." "They might not even bother," Samson chuckled. "Who really cares about this place anyway?" Still gazing at the fort, Claire answered, "The agency will." Samson looked at her. She wouldn't look his way, because Imala was still grinding against him. "Because they'll ask me how my mission went." She waited to see if he would say anything. The only thing she was getting from him, other than Imala's noises, was the constant whisper of wind. "Before you do that," he suddenly responded, "would you give me some time to try something?" She brought her feet inward, crossing her legs, and rested her hands on her ankles. Still looking toward the fort, she asked, "How much time? You are really not going to try and hole up here after the agency sent me to this very place?" "Actually," he began, "I have a feeling we won't be here long at all." "We," she said. Grinning at the fact that she was avoiding looking his way, he simply responded with, "Yeah." She sighed and got to her feet. Facing the fort, she said, "That hot spring, you're going to use it, right?" She then grinned at a sudden thought. How much more does Imala have to pay to finish the first ring? Just one more? Imala gasped. So did Samson. "Claire!" Imala scolded. "Well," Claire continued, still refusing to look their way, "is it true?" She heard light footsteps approaching her, but they stopped a distance away. It was Imala. Her ex-comrade had actually pulled herself from her physical high. "I don't intend to use the hot spring like a shaman in his community, Claire," Samson reassured her. "No?" Claire asked. "No," Samson answered, "but I want to ask for your help." Claire turned her head just enough that she could peer around the edge of her hood with one eye. Imala had indeed stepped away from Samson to approach her. She wasn't covering her lower half, but she was pressing her hands together against her chest. The wrinkle in the middle of her brow, the loss of her drugged smile, Claire could tell what she had inferred actually hurt her. Behind Imala, Samson was offering a spectral smile. Again, because she knew him, the tiny inclinations around his eyes and mouth, this was like any other mission they were on. He was asking her to trust him, like she always had. She hadn't called forth a ghostly blade in either hand, although they were both hidden underneath her cloak, along with the rest of her body. Yet, all her fingers were splayed, ready to arm herself. She wondered if Samson knew. Could he read her posture? From the times they had sparred, when she wore her cloak, did he still recognize these things about her? She wondered, too, if she could read that deep into his expressions anymore. For now, she relaxed her fingers. "Well?" What is it you want to do?